Professor Jung and Professor Boor, thank you so much for joining me. Professor Jung, would you like to kindly introduce yourself to listeners?
Hey, Aaron, very nice to be here today in your podcast. My name is Nusrat Jung. I study air quality and air pollution, and I'm really fascinated by things that I cannot see, which is air itself. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And Professor Boor, please.
Good afternoon, Aaron. So I'm Professor Boor. I'm an associate professor in the Bio School of Civil and Construction Engineering at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. Professor Jung and myself are in the same group. We're in the architectural engineering group. We both study indoor air quality and the factors that affect the air inside buildings that we are exposed to for much of our life.
Thank you very much. Why did you choose indoor air quality and more as your field of specialty?
I mentioned earlier that I'm really fascinated by things you cannot see. And in addition to that, things that affect us on a daily basis, right? So air inside buildings is something that surrounds all of us every day. All of the humans that are on this planet really have a safe home to stay. This is our primary wish. We want to have a shelter, but within that shelter, we also have air that we breathe, and the quality of that air really matters because we spend 90% of our time inside buildings, right? So the way I look at it is that you wake up in a building, then you go to another building, then you go to another building, and you ultimately return back to a building. So air that surrounds you really has a huge impact on your everyday exposure.
And of course, people who are listening, people with multiple chemical sensitivity, we're aware of this, and that really affects how we live our lives. It limits us in terms of where we can and cannot be. Your research is really important for folks like us with multiple chemical sensitivity. Professor Boor.
I think I'm continually fascinated by the field. I think it's a very dynamic field because I think there's many aspects to indoor air pollution that are linked to people, so our own bodies. I think a very obvious connection there is the COVID-19 pandemic, where the release of respiratory aerosol propagated the transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And then we have our activities within buildings. We're responsible for the products we bring into our homes, the various chemical products, consumer products, and so forth. The dynamic operation of our ventilation systems has a profound impact on indoor air quality. There's just many aspects that are quite interesting because things change so rapidly. And I believe with studying indoor air quality, I think I've been focused into looking at what are the sources of air pollution, but also looking into ways to mitigate our exposures. So I think we have a lot of opportunities to the intelligent design and operation of buildings to protect ourselves from both outdoor and indoor air pollution. And I think that by understanding where the pollution is coming from, understanding the transformations of these pollutants and chemicals in the air around us, we can make better decisions to try to improve our health and well-being. There's many aspects to the pollution that surrounds us, and it affects people all across the world. And I just think we need to be spending more time thinking about it moving forward.
So I have been thinking about this for a while, and about 7 years ago, I moved to the United States. I became a professor at Purdue University, and during the first and 1.5 year of my living in the US, I started to experience all sorts of hives, itching, extreme sensitivity to my surroundings. I was quite confused. Why is this happening? And I think my first instinct was, is this the water I am drinking? We had a Brita filter at home, so you're using tap water. And in Finland, you drink tap water. It's clean water. So for me, it never clicked that there could be anything wrong with the water. I opened the water report. for Finland, and then I opened the water report for my state and my county, and there was a drastic difference in the chemical loadings that were allowed. So it was quite clear to me that it may be the water. Then I investigated detergents, what I'm eating, what type of foods am I purchasing. I found that a detergent that was actually being sold as natural was not organic. So then I started to understand that there is a difference between how things are being sold. So I called that company up and I asked, what is the constituents of this natural detergent? And I was informed that it is made out of mixtures of 7 different genetically modified corn-based products. And that led me to understand that, okay, I may be allergic to corn. And your body, when it adapts to a new environment, it reacts to different pollutants in different ways. So since last 7 years, my emission journey of understanding buildings, building sciences, outdoor air pollution has now developed very deeply into indoor air quality and the quality of air we are being exposed to, in addition to all the chemistry and physics that is going on around us.
Something I want to ask you about as we move a little bit forward, the study that you did, your conclusion that indoor air pollution is as significant as vehicle exhaust. I wonder if you want to talk to us about that a little bit.
So in that particular study and a few other studies that we have conducted, we have been trying to compare indoor and outdoor sources of air pollution to better contextualize indoor air quality. And one of the things we have been looking at is the release of fragrance chemicals from consumer products. And we have tested a wide variety of fragrance products. We have looked at scented candles, at disinfectants that are fragranced, floor cleaning agents, personal care products, hair care products, essential oil diffusers, and air fresheners. We have systematically looked at the chemical emissions from these products. I think there's 2 parts to this equation: the primary emissions of chemicals to the air, and then the transformations of these chemicals over time, and the secondary products that are produced. So the primary emissions include many volatile organic compounds. Many are associated with the pleasant aroma that these products are intended to create, the smellscape of the indoor environment. Many of these products are very heavily fragranced with things like terpenes. Terpenes are naturally occurring. They're found in vegetation. For example, a pine forest will emit pinene to the atmosphere. These products contain very high concentrations of these fragrances because I think the manufacturers are deliberately trying to create a very strong aroma in the indoor environment. And we have used advanced instrumentation in our labs here at Purdue to measure these chemicals. And the concentrations, put in perspective, are orders of magnitude higher than what you would measure in a forest. So in a forest, you're emitting terpenes to the air. They participate in a lot of atmospheric chemistry, which can lead to, for example, cloud formation. But the concentrations that we measure can be 10, 100, even 1,000 times higher than what you would have in a forested environment. So even while these terpenes may be naturally occurring, and therefore people may believe them to be benign, the concentrations and therefore the chemical exposures, inhalation for sure, as well as potential dermal uptake, could be substantially more than what would occur outdoors. And one unique aspect about a lot of these terpenes, which are found in fragrance products, is that they're highly reactive with ozone. Ozone is found outdoors. It can also be generated indoors through things like laser printers, bipolar ionization devices, things like that. But it primarily comes from outdoors to indoors through building ventilation. Indoor levels are typically less than outdoors because ozone will react with skin oils. It reacts with our clothing, with surfaces. But there's still always some amount of ozone present in an indoor environment. The 2 things will mingle together in the air, and then you'll set forth a series of very complex chemical reactions. So you can imagine that you're using something like a wax warmer or a plug-in air freshener or a scented deodorant. These terpene molecules get into the air, they encounter the ozone molecules, and they trigger the formation of tiny particulate matter, small particles that are suspended in the air that are formed through these reactions. So you end up with a situation where you're exposed to these high levels of these fragrance chemicals and these secondary particles. These are very small particles and they can penetrate very deep into your respiratory system. And we believe that it's this kind of exposure to both the terpenes and stuff in the particle phase, these small particles that are formed, that can be driving some of the adverse health outcomes associated with using these chemical products indoors. So I think when we have a fragrance product, we have to be mindful that it's not only emitting these fragrance chemicals in a large abundance to the indoor environment, it's also forming secondary particulate matter and also very high concentrations. And your body is exposed to all of that. So we try to look at, for example, if you use a wax warmer or you're cleaning your floor with a pine scented cleaning agent, how does this particle production compare to vehicle exhaust? Vehicle exhaust, there are regulations related to that. And we found that just by using a fragrance product that you can pick up at your local retail store can produce particles at the same rate, if not greater, than what is coming out of a car tailpipe. And that may sound alarming, but that's just how it is. These concentrations are just so high that these particle formation events are very intense. And this is something you cannot see with these small particles forming around you. It's not going to create like visible smoke or smog or dust or anything like that, but it is occurring and your body is receiving that exposure. And that may be driving a number of health outcomes that people are experiencing when using these products.
At Purdue University, we have a very sophisticated lab infrastructure. We created a house that has a very controlled building system mechanism. So we are able to very carefully create these controlled emission events and then measure everything about them in a period of time. So your exposure is happening in two different ways. These are active things that are happening around you that are not visible to you at all. Another good way to explain terpenes is, for example, when you are peeling an orange, you smell this orangey smell. They are terpenes, but this is fine and as an orange peel, but it is not fine when you have injected 1,000 orange peels in a little bottle that you have spread in the whole house. Concentrations are so high that we have to use instruments that have been used to measure tailpipe emissions. That's really something serious to understand. We cannot measure them from small instrumentation. What we need to actively think about is removing the sources of pollution in our environment and not creating unnatural chemical environments within the area where we are breathing. You are exposing yourself to a multi-phase source of pollutant on a continuous basis over many years. And if you continue to do that, it will at some point have a cumulative impact.
Absolutely. And I think listeners, sorry to step on your toes, a couple more questions about what is in these toxic products that are sold. You mentioned terpenes, but let me please ask you about fragrance. My understanding is that there are countless different chemical components in fragrance, right? And those can include terpenes, which you mentioned are natural, but we're also talking about VOCs, correct? And formaldehyde and many other things. I don't want you to go through an exhaustive list, but what do you know about fragrance beyond terpenes?
So I think if you look at any scented product, there may be just the word fragrance or fragrances, and usually it's not so descriptive. What does that mean? So even in doing some of our research here, using these fragrance products has been a bit tricky to figure out what exactly is incorporated into these formulations. So terpenes are volatile organic compounds, and there are other non-terpene fragrance additives in these products. some of which we can measure using our instrumentation, and sometimes it's a bit tricky to figure out exactly what is present. Often, if it's added or incorporated in a small weight percentage, the manufacturer does not necessarily need to list out all the components to the fragrance. So it has been a bit challenging to really identify all the different volatile organic compounds that are creating the aroma. Certainly, terpenes are a big part of that equation, but there are chemically manufactured fragrances as well that are incorporated. And they all have different kind of, I think, purposes in terms of kind of the olfactory experience to create different notes in the fragrance. I think I hit on terpenes because terpenes are a particular component of these products that are highly reactive with ozone. So I think that because they are reactive with ozone, they can form the particulate matter, these secondary products that could be quite harmful to our health. So I am not sure about some of these non-terpene fragrances, about their kind of contribution to particle formation, because I don't know how reactive they are with ozone. But I think this kind of tells us that we need to better investigate what is being emitted. And once these chemicals are in the air, how did they undergo transformations that may produce potentially more toxic products? So I think there's different elements to that. I think one thing that we did look at is non-fragrance components of personal care products. So I'll let Professor Jung talk about this from the perspective of hair care products, but there are components to these fragrance products that are not responsible for the fragrance themselves, but are very concerning from a health perspective.
One of our papers that came out of our lab last year, it was a major discovery, comes from the hair care products. So as you can see, I have curly hair and I have a struggle since I was a teenager in managing them. You always want to look professional, and that involves straightening your hair. I always wondered when I did that when I was younger, what am I seeing or what are these fumes? So while I became a professor, and got more into emissions and the sources of the emissions, and then understanding my indoor environments, I was like, let me check out what am I breathing. I found out via some studies, one of it coming from Sweden, and that surprised me. So these hair care products and heat protectants to protect your hair from being damaged while you expose them to high degrees of heat. We found that most of these products have a compound that is being added to these heat protectants to protect your hair, but at the same time, when you apply heat to them, it goes through a thermal degradation process that further exacerbates it in the air right next to your mouth. They have been found to have a profound impact on aquatic life and the quality of aquatic life. If it is having a profound impact on aquatic life, it is going to have a profound impact on humans. It is bioaccumulated, which means after you have inhaled it, somehow it is gone inside you and it's not going to leave your system. So if you are conducting this activity every day for 30 years, what is your cumulative exposure? So again, this is not initiated by the product, but the process that product experienced via consumer, right? So consumer is applying it. So I think there is this thinking of life cycle that needs to be brought into our discussions. So what is happening once you purchase it? You bring it home, and what happens to it? So it's really complex. We are finding all of these chemicals finding their pathway into our breathing zone.
Could you put your finger on maybe a particular kind of product that piques your concern these days when it comes to fragrance, chemical fragrance? Because we know, anecdotally, people tell me all the time, and we know that companies are making products to smell stronger, for the smells to last longer. Anything on your radar these days when it comes to fragrance products?
In terms of products, particularly on our radar, I would urge people to actually just take a walk through their grocery store and look at all of the products, they are increasingly pumped with fragrances. So it's not one product, it's hundreds of them. It's hard to pinpoint one because there are just simply an overwhelming amount of them.
So I think, as Professor Jung mentioned, just at any retail store here in the United States, we just have aisles of scented products. For the average consumer, this information about what are these fragrances, it's not very clear from just buying the product. Also, I think a lot of people want to buy the product because of the fragrances. And I think Professor Jung and myself try to tell people that clean air should not have any scent associated with it. Of course, the absence of any scent does not mean the air is necessarily clean. But I think this kind of perception that if the air smells like a forest or lavender and things like that, that's clean, and that's not the case. We like to put scented products onto our bodies to mask naturally occurring volatile organic compounds that are released from our skin and sweat, for example, or exhaled breath. But all these scents, can cause, I think, a number of problems because a lot of them are very reactive molecules, and the concentrations can get very high during active use of these products. Work that we have done and others have found that if people are applying scented personal care products to their body, they become basically a walking mobile source of these volatile chemicals over time. So if somebody's getting ready in the morning, they're applying heavily fragranced deodorant, perfume, cologne to their body, and then they're in a shared space, other people will be exposed to the residual emissions that are coming off of their body. So these chemicals are volatile, so they want to evaporate, but they're still coming off your body for some period of time. I think another thing to mention that Professor Jung and I are interested in are laundry products. There's been, I think, a big push to make even more heavily fragranced laundry products. Of course, we had the detergent when you're cleaning your clothes, but then there's a lot of effort now for like different things you can add to your dryer. So your clothes are very heavily fragranced and you take them out of the dryer. Again, this, I think, for people that are aware of these issues would stay away from those products. But if a lot of other people are conditioning their clothes with these heavily fragranced laundry products, you layer that on top of the personal care products that are already heavily fragranced, and you have additional residual chemical emissions from clothes coming from people throughout the day. And so I think it's just like this kind of attitude that if it smells good, then it's clean. And I think that attitude applies to cleaning products as well, disinfectants and so forth. But I think that we need to be thinking that's maybe not the correct framing of things. And if we are just dumping in large quantities of fragrances to products we apply to our skin, to our hair, to our clothes, people then become mobile sources of these chemicals over time. So I think that you can eliminate stuff from your home, but the moment you go to your office or your child goes to school, they can have these secondary exposures if other people have used these fragrance products on their bodies, on their clothes, prior to coming to that shared indoor space. I think also if a space like a classroom or office is cleaned with fragrance products, fragrance cleaning products for the floor, for surfaces, then you can walk in the next day and be exposed to those chemicals as well. Of course, the exposure would be less than when the chemical is actively being applied to the surface, but there could always be this kind of lingering of these molecules throughout an indoor space over time. Some are vented outdoors, but some get trapped on surfaces and then they could come back off to the air. I think a good example of this is things like third-hand tobacco smoke exposure and things like that, that some of these molecules, they will be vented out of the house, but some like to stick to surfaces. Basically, you can envision that there's this surface reservoir that's created, and some of these molecules will be trapped onto the wall, onto furniture, and can come back out into the air, and then you can be exposed. So I think this is an issue for people that are entering these shared spaces where some of these chemicals can be off-gassing from stuff, and you can be exposed even if you stayed away from those products entirely yourself.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned these products because they're definitely on our radar. Personally speaking, the laundry products, the dryer products, air fresheners, the plugins, the candles, these are huge kryptonites for me and for thousands, if not millions of people. who have chronic chemical intolerance and multiple chemical sensitivity. And we struggle, like myself, I'm a university educator. And because of my multiple chemical sensitivity, I can't be in the classroom. So fortunately, I have a medical accommodation to teach and do my research all online, because the moment I walk in and, like you say, I go into shared spaces, whether it's commuting on a public transit or in the spaces where I'm breathing in the emissions from laundry products and body sprays and cosmetic products and beauty products, I become extremely ill. And that leads to the next question, which is, what can we do? We can stay away. We can make our homes space safe as possible. We can lobby for change. We can ask our employers to provide a fragrance-free or fragrance awareness policy. But as you mentioned, these are very hard to enforce. What can we do? Can regulation or human resource departments ever have any luck or any success in enforcing policies that will help?
I think it may be difficult. I think just any regulations pertaining to indoor air quality are either non-existent or insufficient. There are some for occupational environments, but generally they are not where they need to be. And I think after the COVID-19 pandemic, I think more and more people have become aware of indoor air quality issues. But I think looking at chemicals is a little bit more difficult. For example, we can wear a face mask that will block out particulate matter, which could include particles that carry viruses and bacteria. But a lot of these fragrances are in the gas phase, unless, of course, they're forming particles, as I mentioned earlier. But they're in the gas phase. Simple face mask is not going to mitigate your exposure to these volatile organic compounds. They're going to penetrate to that face mask quite efficiently. And of course, wearing like a respirator is not a viable solution. So it is tricky. And I think when you talk about buildings, you can say better ventilation. That comes with some caveats. As I mentioned earlier, ozone comes from outdoors primarily to the indoor environment through ventilation. And we just published a study, Professor Jung and I, on if you increase outdoor air ventilation, which is generally viewed as a good thing, you provide more ozone to the space. That ozone then reacts with all these chemicals in these fragrance products, including many terpenes, that form these particles. So that's a tricky thing. And in some areas of the country, the outdoor air pollution may not be great. For example, if you were in Los Angeles during the wildfires, you don't want to bring that toxic wildfire smoke into your house. You may be in a low-income community where there's a lot of sources of anthropogenic air pollution around you from industrial activities or car exhaust along the highway, and you don't necessarily want to bring all that stuff indoors. So ventilation generally is a good thing, but you need to be thinking about scrubbing these things out. Particulate matter can be scrubbed out with conventional HVAC filters, but things like ozone and NOx and outdoor volatile organic compounds are much more difficult to remove. And because of that, they're also difficult to remove if they're introduced into the indoor environment. So if you had a shared space like a classroom or an office, and people are releasing these volatile organic compounds from their clothing, their bodies, and other consumer products, it's not really that easy to scrub those chemicals out within the ventilation system. We typically do not have air cleaning technologies to scrub these things out. There are efforts to create these products, but they're not widely used in any manner. Things like activated carbon filters can remove volatile organic compounds, but they get saturated quite quickly. So they may not necessarily be a long-term solution. So it's hard to operate the building in a way to protect people from these chemical exposures because these are in the gas phase. And a conventional filter or a face mask or a portable air cleaner that has conventional filter media will not remove these volatile organic compounds very efficiently. If we use activated carbon, that will certainly help, but that can become saturated quite quickly because of the high chemical loadings, and it either needs to be regenerated or replaced. So it is difficult to treat the air in these spaces to remove some of these chemicals. And the best thing, as you mentioned, is to try to help people become aware that if you're in a shared space and you have people that have chemical sensitivities, that maybe they should refrain from using these heavily fragranced products on their bodies and their hair, and their clothes. How to enforce that, I'm not sure the best strategy, but increasing awareness of this, I think, would certainly help, given the ubiquity of these products in any retail store And because of that, people are buying them and they're using them. So it is a difficult situation. And maybe there should be some regulations on the kind of just the amount of fragrances that can be integrated into these products. But that would require, I think, some better data on the health outcomes of these
Mm-hmm.
products, the
Mm-hmm.
chemicals themselves, both
Mm-hmm.
short term and long term for different demographics.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I think the first thing we need to do is to understand what are these fragrances. So many of it is put under the label of proprietary information because it's your brand value. Fragrances are of very high intensity, so we can't measure them on the basis of weight percentage. So anything that will falls under certain weight percentage does not require to be reported on the label. The other thing I want to point out is Professor Boor tried to explain the face mask and the gas face. So, very good example of this is that if you're wearing a face mask in public and someone is smoking next to you, you still smell the smoke that's in the gas phase. So you are only able to filter so much. That's a good way to think about what is in particle phase, what is in the gas phase. Third thing that I do have hope. We used to smoke indoors. There was a time where it was fashionable to smoke indoors. I have friends and family members who joke now that when they were young, they were smoking in their bedrooms. There were ashtrays right next. Things change. Society has the ability to evolve. We need to continually think about creating spaces for all people, those who have sensitivities or do not have sensitivities. To the fellow listeners who do not have these sensitivities, you may suddenly realize that you're very sensitive to certain chemical right after you have been exposed to it. So it is not good to be dismissive, especially of people who experience these sensitivities. And I think that lobbying is one thing, but we need to invest in research to actually investigate this. So please note that we are able to make these discoveries enabled by National Science Foundation, which is really has been the source of doing very innovative work and has really uplifted both of our labs, also Environmental Protection Agency. These are great institutions in the United States of America who have advanced science to leaps and bounds. So we really need to invest in research. One more point I want to make is it's not one person, it's not one product, it's the cumulative effect that is not going to reap very positive results. So we need to really think about it and be careful about it.
I realize you're not experts in multiple chemical sensitivity, but knowing what you know about chemicals and the harms and the potential for impact on human health and the environment, many of us experience dismissal by medical providers, by physicians who tell us it's not real, it's in our heads, and even loved ones regularly dismiss us. What would you say to a doctor who dismisses people with multiple chemical sensitivity, for example, knowing what you know about chemicals?
So, Aaron, I would say that the medical professionals have been taught in a very specific way to make decisions based on evidence of things. So it is really hard to pinpoint and say that this exposure has resulted in this physical outcome. It is the cumulative exposure over time to multiple chemicals that can then result or manifest in a physical ailment. So a doctor, a medical doctor, is really looking at it from a different set of glasses. They are looking at it from your physical body, your organs, your blood pressure, your temperature. So I think there is this gap in translation of the discoveries that have come out of our lab. This information now needs to move to those who can actually do some sort of health assessments. I'm very supportive of the medical community as well, because I have had my own health issues and they have saved my life. And I appreciate so much service and hard work that they do. But I do encourage them to also have an open mind to what else may be outside that is being introduced into people's homes, their environment, that will have and has an impact on us that may not be directly visible, but will and may manifest over time.
And I would add that I think a lot of these fragrance chemicals are not widely monitored in indoor environments. And I think that prevents us from having clear associations between exposures and health outcomes among different populations, including those that have chemical sensitivities. Much of our knowledge about the impact of air quality on health comes from only a few components of the air. I think these fragrance chemicals are much more prevalent indoors than outdoors. And a lot of our epidemiological work comes from outdoor air quality monitoring rather than indoor air quality monitoring, because we don't have robust indoor air quality monitoring networks. And so I think that we just need to be doing a better job at looking at the presence of these fragrance chemicals in shared indoor spaces, offices, classrooms, and so forth, and have better data on concentrations, concentration trends. What are the exposures? Where are these compounds coming from? Better assessment on how we could try to remove them from the air. As I mentioned, I think that's a tricky space. But if we just develop better monitoring infrastructure, I think we'd have a better assessment on what are the intakes into our body, and then we can better pinpoint the impact on our health and being inclusive of all different groups of people that are respond to these chemicals differently. These chemical loadings are substantial when these products are being used, but also this kind of residual emissions, as I mentioned, are also of concern. You can go throughout your day and not really understand what your exposures are. So if you go to your medical doctor and try to say, I'm feeling this way, it's difficult because there's not good data on what you were really exposed to. And I would add that these kind of home air quality monitors that do pick up some things are not very good with some of these components of these fragrance products. So it's hard then for you to really understand what you're being exposed to and then report that information to somebody like a medical professional, because even the sensors that we're using are not very sensitive to these particular compounds. So it's a tricky situation when you don't really have that quantitative data. I think is really necessary to establish links between concentrations and exposures and then health outcomes. So I think there's just a lot of gaps there.
You mentioned more research needs to be done, and there isn't a lot, but how much research is happening about toxic chemicals and fragrance? Are you very isolated in your work?
I think it's far from where it needs to be. I think there's growing interest in volatile chemical products, which includes many of these fragrance products, which are primarily used indoors. And I think it's difficult because, as Professor Jung mentioned, you go to a store, there's just aisles of this stuff. There's so many different types of products that are releasing different things in different ways, like spray canisters versus creams and things like that. And how these products are used affects their emissions. So there's a lot of complexity there. So I think there's a long way to go. And we have to do a bunch of different simulations. The hair care products are a unique use scenario. So I think that there's just many different kind of simulations that have to be done in kind of controlled laboratory conditions to understand what is being released from these products.
I'm so glad I found your research, and I'm really grateful to both of you for taking time to speak on the podcast. And I'm pretty sure listeners are going to be really fascinated and grateful for the work you're doing. So thank you again.